What's up, Multiverse of Mayhem fans? For years, there's been one massive question hanging over the Marvel Cinematic Universe. When are the X-Men finally coming? And who is going to play them? We already knew Marvel Studios was developing an X-Men movie, but knowing the mutants are coming is one thing. Knowing exactly who will carry one of Marvel's most iconic franchises into a completely new era is something else entirely. And now, Marvel has finally given us the answer. At D23 2026, Kevin Feige unveiled the principal cast of the new X-Men film. Sadie Sink as Jean Grey, Kit Connor as Cyclops, Christopher Abbott as Professor X, Indy Navarrete as Rogue, Maya Boyd as Storm, and Adam Driver as Mr. Sinister. The film is currently scheduled to arrive in May 2028, and honestly, this casting is fascinating, not because every choice is immediately obvious, but because together these actors suggest Marvel may be taking the X-Men in a very different direction from the Fox movies. Let's start with Sadie Sink as Jean Grey, because this could be one of the most important choices in the entire lineup. Sink is already familiar to millions of viewers through Stranger Things, but Jean Grey presents an entirely different challenge. Jean isn't simply another member of the X-Men, she's one of the foundational characters of the franchise, and her history is closely tied to some of the biggest stories in X-Men mythology. The danger for Marvel is obvious. Audiences have already seen Jean Grey on the big screen, and previous movies placed enormous emphasis on the Phoenix storyline. Marvel now has the opportunity to do something smarter. Establish Jean as an actual character before making her mythology the centerpiece of everything. That's important because Jean Grey works best when she's more than just her powers. She's a telepath, a telekinetic, a member of the original X-Men in the comics, and someone whose relationships with the rest of the team are essential to her character. If Marvel wants this new franchise to last for years, Jean needs to become someone audiences care about before the story starts escalating into cosmic territory. Sink gives Marvel an actor with the opportunity to grow into that role, rather than immediately having to recreate what came before. Then there's Kit Connor as Cyclops, and this might be the casting decision I'm most excited about. Cyclops has always been one of the most important X-Men in the comics, but the movies haven't always treated him that way. James Marsden's version was an important part of the original films, but the Fox franchise increasingly centered Wolverine, leaving Cyclops with considerably less room to develop. That's unfortunate because Scott Summers is arguably one of the most important leaders in X-Men history. Cyclops isn't interesting simply because he shoots optic blasts. He's interesting because he's a leader who constantly has to make difficult decisions. He's disciplined, strategic, and responsible for people who are often dealing with extraordinary circumstances. That gives Marvel the opportunity to make Scott one of the emotional and dramatic centers of the new franchise. Kit Connor is an intriguing choice for that reason. His performance in Heartstopper demonstrated that he can play a young character dealing with expectations, relationships, vulnerability, and the pressure of figuring out who he is. Those qualities could translate extremely well to a younger Scott Summers. The real test will be whether Connor can make audiences believe that this is someone the X-Men would actually follow. If he can, Marvel could finally give Cyclops the spotlight the character has deserved for decades. Next is Christopher Abbott as Professor Charles Xavier, and this is another casting decision that tells us Marvel isn't trying to simply recreate the Fox movies. Patrick Stewart's Professor X became iconic, and there would be very little point in trying to imitate that performance. Abbott gives Marvel an opportunity to establish an entirely different interpretation of Charles Xavier. Because here's the thing about Professor X, he isn't necessarily as simple as the wise mentor figure that casual audiences might remember. In the comics, Xavier's dream of peaceful coexistence between humans and mutants has frequently been complicated by the lengths he's willing to go to protect that dream. He's a brilliant strategist and teacher, but he's also capable of secrecy and morally questionable decisions. That's fertile territory for a new adaptation. Marvel doesn't have to make Xavier a perfect mentor. They can make him complicated. They can make audiences question whether his methods actually match his ideals. And with Christopher Abbott taking over the role from Patrick Stewart, Marvel has a clean opportunity to build that version from the ground up. Then there's Inde Navarrete as Rogue. Rogue is another character who has already appeared in the Fox films, but the MCU has an opportunity to explore aspects of her character that weren't necessarily the focus of those movies. Her mutant ability is inherently emotional because physical contact itself can become dangerous. Rogue's powers allow her to absorb the abilities and memories of others, which means something as simple as touching another person can have enormous consequences. That gives Marvel something incredibly valuable, a superhero whose powers naturally create character conflict. Rogue doesn't need an enormous CGI battle to be interesting. Her abilities can affect her relationships, her sense of identity, and her fear of hurting other people. That's exactly the kind of character-driven storytelling that can make the MCU's X-Men feel different from a standard superhero team. Maya Boyd as Storm is another major opportunity. Storm is one of the most recognisable X-Men in Marvel history, and she has already been portrayed by Halle Berry and Alexandra Shipp in the Fox franchise. But the MCU gets a chance to establish Aurora from the beginning within a much larger universe. And Storm isn't simply the weather character. She's one of the X-Men's most important leaders in the comics. She's intelligent, powerful, experienced, and capable of commanding an entire team. If Marvel gives her the character development she deserves, she could become one of the defining figures of this new X-Men generation. But then Marvel dropped the casting choice that really got people talking. Adam Driver as Mr. Sinister. This is fascinating because Mr. Sinister is not the obvious first villain most casual audiences would expect from an X-Men reboot. Nathaniel Essex, better known as Mr. Sinister, is a geneticist obsessed with mutant evolution and genetics. He's a very different kind of antagonist from someone like Magneto, and that could be exactly why Marvel chose him. Marvel has already had major cinematic versions of Magneto, Mystique, Apocalypse, and other X-Men villains. Starting this new era with Mr. Sinister gives the studio an opportunity to establish a threat audiences haven't already seen extensively in live action. And Adam Driver is an inspired actor for that kind of role. Driver has repeatedly demonstrated that he can play intense, eccentric, unpredictable characters, which could make Sinister genuinely unsettling. The character doesn't have to be a villain who simply wants to destroy the X-Men. His obsession with mutant genetics can make him dangerous in a much more personal way. He can treat mutants as experiment specimens or evolutionary opportunities rather than people. And Marvel doesn't need to completely reinvent those themes. It just needs to understand them. And this is where the casting becomes more interesting as a group rather than individually. Jean Grey, Cyclops, Professor X, Rogue, Storm, Mr. Sinister, those aren't random characters. They represent some of the foundational pieces of X-Men mythology. You have the mentor, the leader, the powerful telepath, the emotionally complicated young mutant, one of the team's greatest leaders, and a villain deeply connected to mutant genetics. Marvel hasn't revealed the complete plot, so we shouldn't pretend we know exactly how these characters will interact or what the story will be about. But the lineup itself suggests that Marvel is building the foundation of an X-Men world rather than simply making another superhero movie. And that's probably the most important thing Marvel can do. Because the biggest challenge isn't convincing people to watch an X-Men movie. People already love the X-Men. The challenge is convincing them that they need another version. The Fox films gave us Patrick Stewart, Ian McKellen, Hugh Jackman, James Marsden, Halle Berry, Famke Janssen, Anna Paquin, and an entire generation of characters that audiences already associate with these roles. Marvel cannot simply recreate those performances and expect audiences not to compare them. Marvel has the opportunity to do the same thing with the X-Men. And there's another major advantage this time around. These characters are finally entering the MCU proper. The X-Men don't exist in isolation anymore. Marvel now has the ability to place mutants alongside the Avengers, the Fantastic Four, Spider-Man, Wakanda, and the supernatural characters being introduced elsewhere in the universe. But that doesn't mean Marvel should immediately turn the first X-Men movie into a giant crossover. In fact, I think the opposite would be smarter. Let the X-Men be the X-Men. Let audiences understand Scott and Jean. Let Professor X's ideology develop. Let Storm become a leader. Let Rogue discover what her powers mean. Let the mutant community actually exist as its own world. Then, when these characters eventually collide with the wider MCU, it will actually mean something. That's why the May 2028 release date is so important. Marvel has time to build this properly instead of rushing the entire mythology onto the screen. And ultimately, that's what makes this casting so exciting. We don't know the entire story yet. We don't know how the X-Men will be introduced to the MCU. We don't know how large the mutant population will be. We don't know whether Mr. Sinister will be the central villain or simply one piece of a much larger story. And we shouldn't pretend we know any of that until Marvel actually tells us. What we do know is that Marvel has finally chosen the actors who will define its next generation of X-Men. Sadie Sink, Kit Connor, Christopher Abbott, Indy Navarrete, Maya Boyd, and Adam Driver. The Fox era gave us the first cinematic X-Men generation. Marvel now has the opportunity to build the next one. And if these actors can make audiences forget about comparing them to the previous versions, if they can make Jean Grey, Cyclops, Professor X, Rogue, Storm, and Mr. Sinister feel like their characters, then Marvel may have just found the foundation for its next great superhero saga. Because the goal isn't to replace Hugh Jackman, it isn't to replace Patrick Stewart, it isn't to recreate the Fox X-Men. The goal is much harder. It's to make a new generation of fans say, this is my X-Men. And that is the real challenge, and potentially the biggest opportunity Marvel Studios has in front of it. So what do you think? Did Marvel nail the casting, or are there choices you're still not convinced about? Is Kit Connor finally going to give Cyclops the spotlight he deserves? Can Sadie Sink make Jean Grey her own? And most importantly, what do you think about Adam Driver as Mr. Sinister? Let me know in the comments, and if you enjoyed this deep dive, make sure to like, subscribe to Multiverse of Mayhem and turn on notifications, because the next era of Marvel is only getting started. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.